Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I'm delighted to have John Browett. John has a wealth of experience. He's done a whole range of different jobs, which I'm going to get him to talk about in a minute. But he's just, as well as the chairman of the Octopus Group, he's just been made the chairman of the Institute of Directors, which in the UK is a very important organization helping business leaders at all levels to succeed. So without further ado, John, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me.
No, it's really lovely to have you on, and we knew each other a while ago. I think you just finished being the CEO at Monsoon Accessorize, and I was coaching the CFO then, who became the CEO after you, and really enjoyed that. Let's just do a little bit of an explanation for those listening of the range of fascinating jobs from EasyJet and various other things that you've been involved in a leadership role, and you've done many CEO roles. Just give us a flavour across.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a sense very lucky. I mean, I started work as an investment banker, in fact, doing buyouts with a mezzanine fund, and then quickly realised I didn't want to be the finance person. I wanted to actually run businesses. So I went to business school and then worked at the Boston Consulting Group, and was extremely lucky in my early 30s to join Tesco, and they hired me as I suppose what people outside would call strategy director, although strategy was not the word we used. We used business plan or business development for that. And then literally a year into that, I got the chance of starting up Tesco.com, which is the big online grocery business in the UK. I think it's still one of the biggest in the world, and very successful and profitable, and became very much a model for how you should do those things. And that was really my start of proper leadership roles. And then I got to do the turnaround of Dixon's Retail, which was a big electrical retailer in Europe, and that went out pretty well. In fact, my career at that point was flying, and I got hired by Tim Cook to be SVP of Apple's retail operations worldwide, based in Cupertino. But unfortunately, that didn't work out, so I got fired after 6 months. And then came back and ran a couple of smaller businesses, Monsoon Accessorize, which is where we met, and then Dunelm, which is a big homewares retailer in the UK. And then 7 years ago, I actually stopped doing full-time exec work and moved over to being non-executive chairman of various organizations. So it's been quite a journey.
That has been a huge journey. And you also had a really good grounding, I believe, at Cambridge doing natural sciences. Was that right?
That's right. Yes, I was a comprehensive schoolboy who managed to get into Cambridge. Grew up rural poor in Rutland, which is a beautiful place, but not a great place to get going in life in that sense. And I was very lucky, got into Magdalen College and did natural sciences, which was a revelation for me at the time.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting, having had one daughter go to Bristol. Harriet got a first there, and the other daughter, Bryony, went to Cambridge and got a first. She was at Homerton, which is now a full college. But it is so interesting, the mix of people from different backgrounds.
Yes.
And yes, it was traditionally, and you can look at the image of the Toffs and that they all went there. But it has given people some incredible opportunities. I remember when Bryony was there, she, having done very well in the Mount School in York, she thought she was anxious about what it was like, and that she would find herself at the bottom of the group of clever people. But actually, the competitive drive in her made her still compete and
yes,
and aim to. But I think it really gave her an incredible lift in life and a confidence and a way of thinking differently from how she would have done had she gone somewhere else. I don't know what your experience was. And
that was very similar to my own. I went and I thought I might struggle and was surprised that I was just the same as all the other students. And of course, there were some very bright people at Cambridge, so don't get me wrong. But I was like, oh no, I'm actually here for the right reasons, and that was great. And of course, it opens up opportunity, which in a way, if you come from my kind of background, my father was a truck driver, and I was the first person in my family to complete university. So it was quite a big thing.
Yeah, well, it is a big thing. And Rutland for me is just down the road. We're in Maggie's old stomping ground of Grantham.
Right. Yes.
in Lincolnshire countryside. And so, yeah, I've been through Rutland Water and that whole area. But that takes us on nicely. You mentioned Dad, and we were just talking about, you and I, before the program started, how that those in life who have and this is a massive generalization, but I think it's myself as an amateur philosopher looking at the many people I've coached over the years, that, and I include myself in this group, a lot of those who seem to appear to have been successful in some way, according to society, probably have had a dysfunction in their family upbringing or whatever that's driven them to exceed the norm, to go above and beyond. Whereas others who've had a pretty steady time, they're quite happy with what they've got and contented, and nothing really, they don't sort of stand out from the crowd. They just probably live quite a happy, balanced life, work-life balance being good. And as someone once said to me, if you think there's many dysfunctional families, show me a functional one. I just, every one of them has some kind of demon in the closet. But you were mentioning to me, father there as a truck driver in rural Rutland, and in some ways that relationship with him drove you and pushed you to prove to him that you were good enough. Do you want to say?
That's right. I think it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? So I mean, you're right. I think a lot of people who've been successful have got that drive and energy, and they're prepared to make sacrifices in order to actually to succeed in a professional or even a sporting life or whatever the area they've chosen to go for. And that was certainly true for me. I mean, I was extremely driven to succeed. I mean, I came from as I said, relatively poor background. I didn't have a great relationship with my father. In fact, a very poor relationship. I think for 20 years, I didn't even speak to him. And part of when I've been through this in therapy, was one of the things you do as you get older, is you start to understand why this is the case. And in some of the therapy sessions I went through, I realized that actually my drive and energy came from wanting to prove to my father I was good enough. And he did treat me very differently from my brothers. I mean, I've got 3 brothers, and that definitely lived with me throughout the whole of my life. And so that was the bit which spurred me on. And we were talking about this earlier. I mean, there's a lovely thing which you sort of see from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who seemed to also have had a very tough relationship with his father. And Arnold doesn't blame him in any way, shape, or form. Neither do I blame my father, because in a way, that experience made us the people we are. And, that's where the drive and energy comes from to be successful. So that was, no, I think it's absolutely true. And you've got to understand that in order to understand also some of the negativity around that. I mean, one of the problems which I had early in my leadership career, I wasn't prepared to suffer fools gladly at all. And so therefore I used that drive much, much too hard with my own teams.
Yeah, and I do think any of the strengths that we have, passion, drive, whatever it is, ambition. I, for example, look back, and Richard Dannett was my commanding officer at one stage. He's now Lord Dannett in the House of Lords, and a great inspiration to me and quite a father figure. And I remember time and again he'd say, "John, just don't be so intense. Be competitive with your peer group." And I was massively competitive with my peer group, who indeed were very competitive with me. And you go to the Army Staff College, and you're already in the top 10% of your generation, and then you're fighting to become the top of that one. And while I came out in the top 10% of Staff College, I think I'd been just way too competitive and didn't get picked up as I was expecting for the early command, and therefore, in many ways, got the message that perhaps, while I'd had a good career, I wasn't going to be one of the greats who was going to be one of these top generals, and chose to come out and go into business, which I'm very glad I did. But you get sometimes, as you were saying at Apple, you get a comeuppance where you go, oh, right, that's a bit of a wake-up call. I thought I was really fabulous and God's gift. Just on the topic of fathers and relationship, they talk about it in I've done a number of self-development courses on this Hoffman. I think I mentioned to you the Hoffman Institute, and also the Mankind Project, and an 11-day Vipassana Buddhist silent meditation retreat. It gives you lots of time to reflect and look back on your life. I, on one of these courses, had a marvelous opportunity at the age of 62 to have a conversation in a role play with my long dead father to get my father's blessing, because the father's blessing is almost like you so wanted as a little boy, age 2.5, dad was killed, to have someone who was proud of you, to tell you they loved you.
Yeah.
And that what you've done in your life, even the mistakes I've made and getting divorced in my first marriage and like that, but he'd forgive me for all that. And he was just proud of who I was. And they so played it so well that I had, and I won't even explain how cleverly it was done, my father's blessing. I had this conversation 62 years on with my father, and it's been such a release. It was only a month ago, but that liberation, whether it be through therapy or whatever you might do, where you deal with the demons from your past as a leader, so you actually become more authentic, more genuine, that you strip off the masks. I don't know about you, but
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'll tell you a little story about that. So, as I said, I didn't speak to my father for 20 years. I'm not going into the rights and wrongs of this. Eventually, I had actually a personal tragedy. I lost some twins along the way, with genetic disorder, nothing we could do about it. I remember after the last twin died, I thought, this is ridiculous. Life is too short. I need to talk to my father. So I got back in contact with him. We actually, I went with one of my brothers, and we who'd also fallen out with him, and we basically restitched our relationship. And of course, the thing which you realize is the great thing which comes from a family is that unconditional love and support you get from your parents. And I've been missing that throughout the whole of my sort of formative, career years, etc. Just 1 second. There's somebody calling. I need to get this delivery. Sorry.
Okay, that's no problem.
Yeah.
So, John, we just had a short break there, but you're talking about going back to restitch the relationship with your father, with your brother. What was the learning that you took from that?
Well, it's this great thing about support and how you need that support sometimes in life. And I remember when I got many years later, I been to America working for Apple, dream job, but I got fired after 6 months. And I remember going back to my country house. I was absolutely devastated. It was the first time I'd really had a serious knockback in my career. And my father heard that I was up at my country house. And he was around the house. Literally, it felt like 15 minutes after I arrived. God knows how he knew I was there. And I was out in the garden, gardening, and he was talking to me. And he was going on how wrong it was and how I was a great person and everything else. I do remember looking up at him and saying, Dad, I do think they actually had a point. But it was that really unconditional support which you got at that moment. And you think, yeah, that's a really important part of family life. And of course, a lot of us don't always get that as we go through. And of course, it causes quite a lot of dissonance and, in my case, drive and energy, but also, sometimes being a bit unreasonable about what we had to do.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting you raise. A couple of points I want to sort of pick up, really. The first one is that this whole theme of unconditional love from a partner, from family, that will be in your corner when you are very low and you're down. And the other one is the importance of the three hums. My friend, Professor Roger Steer, would talk about the three hums: humility, humanity, and a bit of humor, self-deprecating humor. Yeah. That we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. But I think as we have success after success on the sort of golden thread, you can tend to believe your own hype and think.
Exactly.
And we were talking about this, you and I, earlier, that
exactly.
A whole series of events have happened, some great headwinds in your favor, things go well, and then you think you're God's gift. And we only need to look at a few politicians like Boris and Liz Truss and Donald Trump to go, people actually eventually believe their own hype, and they become almost a cult that people will follow this. And that when something goes wrong, I still can't believe Liz Truss is going around telling that it was the system was against her and the blob and all this kind of looking for fault elsewhere. I think the really good, inspiring leaders go, do you know what? That was my fault. As you said there, I probably wasn't the right fit. And if I was in their shoes, I probably would have fired myself. I know, I made some mistakes and it didn't work out for me. And I probably would have done the same to me if I was somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing when you come up against failure like that. I mean, because one side, you don't need failure to completely destroy you. I mean, if you only look at the Olympic athletes, and the Olympics are on as we're speaking, and it's amazing the things which people tell you in the interviews, etc., the highs and lows which the Olympic athletes have had before they then go on to have great success. So if you have a setback, you can't allow it to destroy you. But on the other side, of course, failure is where the great learning comes from. And you have to be able to be man enough or woman enough to actually lean into that situation and say, what did I really get wrong there? What did I learn about myself? Which means that I can be successful in the future. And that's the hardest thing to do, because in the end, your ego is trying to blame everybody else, you know. Classic with Liz Truss, who seems to be in complete denial that she had anything to do with her. That's the wrong approach. You've got to actually be able to sit down calmly, out of the melee, and she probably should have had a break in order to be able to do that, but she was right back into it. And therefore, she's not really got the learnings from that to actually make her a better person in the future.
Yeah, yeah, and I have been very lucky that within the military training, with, you know, being an instructor at the military academy at Sandhurst and Staff College, the Army's very good at having a process to learn. So the Navy SEALs in America, they go, okay, John, you got fired. Good. Now what? You know, like, now, what are you going to do? What are you going to do now? And we'd call it an after action review. What have you learned? What are you going to do? Go away, have a think about it. Come and see me tomorrow morning. Tell me your top 3 learnings and your top 3 actions you're going to take from this. And I think having that time to reflect and review, and rather be sore and blaming everybody else and never learning a single thing, you're apt to go and repeat it again and again because you've not learned anything from it. And I think it's taken me to later in life where I really have been learning enough from a situation. And you and I talked about the sort of Stoic philosophy. It's not the fact that you have a problem, it's how you respond to it that marks out the inspiring leaders from the very average leaders. What's your thoughts?
No, I agree with that entirely. I think if you look at, I mean, when I was growing up, I used to read Forbes magazine, which is a fantastic magazine because it talks to people who, usually entrepreneurs, business people, and it talks to them very honestly about their lives. And the thing which you learn from that magazine very quickly was that the people who really made it, it become, you know, not just worth tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, none of them had a smooth ride. I mean, there are the odd exception, but mostly they had not had a smooth ride. And particularly in America, they'd actually failed 2 or 3 times before they'd really made it big. And what was really interesting is how open they were about their failures and how much they had lent into the learnings about it. Now, it's very, very hard to do that. I think it's particularly difficult in the UK because we don't like failure. We actually like success only. We find failure a very, very difficult thing. As you know, if you make a business bankrupt in the UK, that's gonna be a really tough thing to get out of or to get through. And so, but I think it's the worst thing. In fact, when I'm interviewing people for leadership teams or chief executives, I'm extremely nervous of people who've only known success, because you 9 times out of 10, that means that they actually don't know what really drives them and what leads them to be successful. And so they're very dangerous, because if they get into a situation which is maybe even no fault of their own, where something goes wrong, they at that point don't necessarily know what to do, and they won't necessarily respond in the right way.
That is such an interesting one, and many questions come from that. One is, I'm fascinated in your role, you know, chairman of a couple of organizations, including a prestigious one like the IOD, but a number of NED roles that you've done. When you're interviewing people, there must be 1 or 2 cracking questions that you ask, and it really flushes out really what they're about. I just want to share one anecdote, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And it's called the door handle closed, and based on when you're doing due diligence on hiring somebody, many people find later on that someone is an consummate liar, and they've had lots of 3. I remember one classic case. This guy had been through 3 compromise agreement, and if you looked on his CV, he'd done about 18 months.
Yeah,
there should have been a signal there. But anyway, the door handle close is the one that you would ask someone for a reference. So rather than writing to someone, you've actually got to have the conversation with them, because in writing they have to avoid many things and being sued and things
Yeah,
like that.
I agree with that. Yeah.
It all gets dodgy. But in a conversation, it's much more interesting. And the door handle close is literally you thank them for their help, and that's great. And they get the sense that that's it. So they literally psychologically drop their guard. And you go, oh, before you go, there's this long pause, and you go, is there anything else I should know? And then just leave it. And do you know, it's amazing. They go, well, there was a small case of embezzlement, but it really wasn't so much or well, there was a case of harassment of one of the employees, whatever it might be. But you really flush it out. It's very interesting. It was a long story about a spy who a friend of mine unearthed in Cyprus when he was commanding officer, because he just as the man had saluted and was leaving the room, he said, is there anything else I should know? And the guy said, yes, sir, I've been a spy working for the Bulgarians. And it's a whole story itself.
Wow.
A fascinating one. But
Yeah.
what about you for great, because often the simplest questions and then the supplementary to that are the most powerful. What would you find has worked?
There's one which, by the way, this is not a recommendation, but I suddenly found I was, and I don't like to not drop names because I don't know this individual, but I was listening to a thing which Elon Musk was talking about, and he does the same thing which I do in interviews, which is I ask people to tell me in detail how they made something successful.
Wow.
Now, interestingly, those people who really were at the heart of it will know a lot of detail, and they know a lot of the things which went wrong before they got to the right answer.
And
then, of course, you can find out what their real role was in it.
Yeah.
So if you ask me about how do we make Tesco.com successful, I mean, it's not one thing, it's 100 things. And I can go into detail every single thing. So I was there and actually did it. The same when we did the turnaround of Dixon's Retail, same when we did the digital transformation of Dunelm. And I think the where that people get tripped up is on the detail. And so you have to actually keep on drilling until they actually can't answer the questions. And then you actually kind of know. But it is hard nowadays because people have become very, very good at answering questions.
Yeah.
And so you've got to find a trick or a way of getting in. And the other way of doing it, of course, is it's a really important role, is spending more time with them, because eventually the mask slips. When I was doing stores, I always used to go around and visit stores with people for a day. And eventually you would see how they would behave. So you'd see what they were like with the staff.
Yes.
You would see what they were like around the store in terms of their appreciation of the detail. In store-based retailing, there is a lot of detail before you get to the shelf edge. And the people who are really good at it understand all of that. They understand the complexity of the operating model. So yeah, there are ways and means to find out, but it is hard. People get better and better at it every year.
Yeah, you've made me think of a couple of things. One is that I'm lucky enough to be coaching a CEO of one of the big supermarket names you'd know well, and have worked in, I think, nearly all the supermarkets, coaching some of the senior leaders, and that retail is detail. It is one of the things. But the other one that has come to mind as you talked about that, I once fired a couple of executive coaches when I was a managing director, and they said, yeah, this is really unfair. And, they called me, what do they call me? The Eliminator or something. They had some Terminator. They called me the Terminator. And I took that as a great matter of pride. And I said that the point is how you treat the girls on reception, the ladies on reception. I'll quickly re-add that. It didn't say girls because one of them was young, but how you treat the ladies on reception versus how you suck up to the CEO tells me everything I need to know.
Yeah.
Because you were just so dismissive of them. You didn't know their names. You weren't interested in their lives, what went on. And I think it is so interesting how people treat, as you say, when you're going around a store, the people they think don't influence their careers, but they are the ones that actually will make the business fire up. And And I'll pass back over to you for any more great questions, but I am reminded of you tend to get one or two people who've been in the military who tell you they were, as soon as they tell you I was in the SAS, they weren't. Is the first one, or I was special forces. They weren't
Yes.
special forces, because you really have to wheedle it out of them, because they're just very humble about it. But this one guy was banging on about all the things he'd done in his amazing career, and this rather languid senior friend of mine said, "So while you were saving Western Europe and NATO, what were the rest of the army doing?" As if this guy made out that it was all single-handedly him. And the better people, they talk about, never really was me on my own. I know my shortcomings, and that's why I hire in our army of giants people who are bigger than me to cover areas that I'm not so good at.
Yeah, and a couple of other things which I think work well particularly when you're getting down to personal dynamics, which is, if I'm referencing people, I will now often reference the people who worked for them rather than actually colleagues or the board. Because one of the things which you often find in dysfunctional leadership is suck up, kick down. And so that is quite a good way to actually get past that, and to do it without them recommending who you talk to, so you don't get some acolyte thing. And then the other bit, which I find amazing, is getting people to tell you about a failure and what they learned from that failure.
Yeah.
Now, you have to have quite a lot of presence, I think, to be able to actually do that well. And it tells me a lot about you if you aren't able to answer that question. Because my view, and I think we've talked about this, which is failure actually is the place where you learn the most. Yeah. Success is a terrible master. I mean, really terrible master. It inflates your ego. You take circumstances as your own success rather than the fact you actually were in the right place at the right time, etc. So that's. But if in failure, you really get a sense of, right, what's really gone on here? Why did this not work? What was my contribution? What would I have done differently, etc. And I think that, again, drilling down into, give me an example of where you failed and what you've learned. Everything else is very revealing, because the mental sociopath will immediately tell you it was everybody else's fault. And they were a victim of circumstance. Whereas people who've got humility and are great leaders will actually say, yeah, I got that wrong, and here's what I learned.
Exactly.
It's really useful. Yeah,
I think there's a lot in that. And I wish, I think the New York Jews have a lovely saying, too soon old, too late smart. And I wish I'd ripped off the masks I'd worn over the years, trying to be something I wasn't, or to portray an image. Particularly, you think about it, boarding school and then being an army officer, you felt to survive in a world that, a bit like you were saying, looking for affection from your father, where you didn't get that love and support, and not having a role model father or grandfather, both were killed flying. That I don't want to be a victim. I'm not a victim, but I think now, being comfortable who I am, that I am enough now, but it's taken me to get into my 60s before I have that wisdom. Why didn't I have that, when I was 30, when I would have been much more useful? I would have been a far better leader. And I think that level of self-awareness and humility and humanity early on is very special. And
Jonathan, do you not think those societies changed? I mean, I grew up in the 80s, like you, and we were all a bit Thatcher's children, and it was all about success at that stage. And if, for example, in the first merchant bank I'd worked in, I displayed weakness, that would have ended my career.
Yeah.
So, I think, I'm very much into the power of vulnerability, and I recommend anybody the stuff by Brené Brown on that. Yeah. There's a wonderful TEDx talk on the power of vulnerability, and then shame, which is where vulnerability comes from. I'm completely bought into that. But there are many circumstances where if you actually were to show vulnerability or admit to your shame about getting something wrong, that would be used against you quite quickly. Now, the great news is that if I take my daughter's generation, they have no problem with it, and it's much more acceptable in society. But I think, to a degree, we're all a product of the environment around us, and it wasn't an easy time in the 80s and 90s to be vulnerable.
I think that's exactly right. And again, I would have been eaten alive doing airborne training with the paras if I'd shown vulnerability as the corporal was screaming at me and, give up, you're a complete loser. And I went, do you know what, Corporal, I'm quite exhausted. I might just get on the back of the Land Rover and leave the course. I had to, no, I'm going to do this. I can do this. Now, there's times when each applies, but I do think we respect and we feel more comfortable when we're in a psychologically safe environment where you can do that. Some places are not safe, and they would eat you alive if you were to show any kind of weakness. And then, of course, you get everybody is acting. There's power play going on. The stuff's said on the surface, but there's another whole iceberg below the surface of what really is going on in the organization.
Yeah.
And that's where culture matters, where CEOs like you set up either a toxic or a healthy culture. And that really takes me on to this idea of, you've led many different organizations, which are household names, certainly in the retail, Dunelm, Monsoon, Apple and Dixon's and Tesco. You've been in all of these great ones. You had the advantage of working for Boston Consulting Group as a consultant. You worked in the merchant banks. What do you think when a CEO is trying to get a healthy culture? Would there be 2 or 3 things that you say really matter to set that culture on the right direction rather than it might have been toxic beforehand?
Well, I mean, I lived that a little bit when I was doing the turnaround of Dixon's retail, which I went into the business, and I wouldn't describe that as a healthy culture. And there was very little teamwork at the pro there. My view, that has to come from the top of the organisation. I think you've got to demonstrate exactly what you need. Now, I'm sure some of my colleagues would be a bit shocked to say that because we were on a very vicious turnaround, and therefore we had to move fast, and I had to be very tough as we were going through that. But the one thing which we tried to get going was the trust and teamwork at the most senior level, in order to then actually show the organisation what we wanted and how we wanted to do that. And one of the things I used to do when I was leading these type of organisations, I used to write a one-pager every week to the front line, talking about the stuff we were coping with in the business and the kind of behaviours and kind of things which I wanted. Only through positivity, not through critique. It was a positive affirmation. And I think there are various techniques which you can use to set the culture right and then to demonstrate it to people and to encourage. And many years later, actually, I was in one of the Currys stores, and the store manager came up to me and talked about the culture as much as anything else. And this was years after I'd left. I was quite surprised. And he said, no, you completely changed the culture in the organisation. You gave the stores what they wanted. You saved us. And I said, hang on, this is a team game. But what was very interesting for them, it was very real. And they all felt like they knew me. And so many years after it, I could go into the stores and they would still recognize me. Wow. So that's the kind of impact you can have as a leader if you get that right.
Yeah. I think just as much as there's the humility and humanity, there's also the never forget the shadow that you cast as a leader. It's a very long one. So make sure it is built on positive affirmation, catching people doing things right, calling out examples of what you do want, just as much as being clear of what is not acceptable, what you will stand for, what you won't fall for. Which takes.
Can I give you another example of that, Andrew? Because I learned a lot of it about this when I was was on EasyJet. Now, if you know, it's one of the things which I was the non-executive director at EasyJet, and the interesting thing there is we introduced something called Just Culture. And the Just Culture is actually from a US submarine fleet, nuclear submarine fleet. And famously, they've never had a nuclear accident. And part of the reason they haven't had that, other than good technology, etc., is that they actually have a culture where if something goes wrong at the front end, it's reported up the line with no fear nor favour. And it's the same when you're running an airline like EasyJet. If somebody makes a mistake, you need to know about it. And probably the best example was an Italian engineer in the Milan base, I think it was. He called in from his car on the way home and said, "Oh, I've made a mistake. I've left a tool in an aero engine and it's going to fall out on the as plane takes off, we need to go and look for that tool.
Wow.
Because that tool on takeoff and landing could cause quite a lot of damage to an aeroplane, could cause an accident, etc. Now, he probably could have got away with it without saying anything, but he called in, he said, came back, they found the tool and everything else. And then there was a big investigation around why did he leave the tool? Well, it turned out it was a special tool. He brought the tool to the thing, it was an authorized tool, etc. He'd gone around the system and everything else. But we didn't fire him. What we did is we put in place a whole series of things so that kind of thing couldn't happen again. And that's what is meant by a just culture. It's not a place of recrimination and blame and critique. It's a place of stuff is going to go wrong. We obviously don't want things to go wrong, but we try not to have that. But if they do, then we take the learnings.
Yeah.
And that's how you keep an organization safe. And it's a completely different twist to the organization. I remember a new board director joined EasyJet, and they said to me that we were doing our normal, near miss reporting, and a pilot had done something wrong. And the new director said, "Oh, we should fire the pilot." And the university in the room, we went, no, that's not how we work here, because the point is, if we did that, then you're not going to get the reporting of the near misses. Therefore, you're not going to be able to get to the root cause. Therefore, you're not going to be able to prevent the accidents in the first place. And it's a very, very different view from how I was brought up when I first started work, which was all about blame and shouting.
Yeah. Well, and also when you're in a good news culture where failure is not an option, you got a problem. So when I was in PricewaterhouseCoopers, I've kept in touch with my old partner, and he carried on working for about 10 years in Lehman Brothers after Lehman Brothers crashed. And I said, well, how's it doing? Because, racked up huge debts. He said, you won't believe it, but actually they're paying off most of the debts now. They've had lots of funds that are doing really well. However, there is this one problem where the culture was always failure is not an option. Good news culture. Don't give me that, bad news. I want to have good news. And so what happened before the crash, people would distort graphs and charts and numbers to make it look like things were on the growth, even when they're on the decline. And even after they'd crashed and gone into receivership and been managed, there was still this element in some of the people. They couldn't cope with things going the wrong way, and they had to make it go the right way in their mind. And so they would literally try and distort things, and just
it's an amazing trap in leadership if you're actually in that mode, because unless you can see the truth for actually where you are, you're doomed to failure. I've certainly been in businesses where, I learned this at Tesco, very fortunately, that the customer tells you what the answer is, and so therefore you go out and you do the customer research, and the customer tells you all the things which are great about your business and all the things which actually need to be improved. And there's something at Tesco called Tesco Customer Plan, and they start with a piece of analysis of what do the customers really think of the organization. And it's not happy. It's not, we think you're great. What they're looking for is all the things which are wrong. And if you're able to face into that, of course, it's an incredibly powerful place to be, because you can be self-assured around the success of your organization, but then you can take those learnings to actually become better. And those who just sort of, as you say, are in that good news culture, they never get the opportunity to actually improve the organization because they're not facing into the truth of what's going on.
You are spot on. And I, particularly now in the coaching of different CEOs and their teams with my wife, Lee, we both spend quite a bit of time doing 360 feedback with people. Now, particularly a CEO who loves believing their own hype. One or two of them are very uncomfortable about doing 360. One or two of them. Most of them go, I'm quite used to this. I've done it before. That's fine. But I deliver it in such a way that they can digest it, but it's still got the really uncomfortable messages, but with something they can do about it, rather than just blanket criticism for which they can do nothing with it. But it's like, this is working well, but this would make you even better if you were to do it. Because I do think, believing your own hype is the road to ruin, and everybody benefits from 360 feedback. And it's such a key part of what you do.
But it requires, you see, this interesting bit is it requires that confidence and security of you're okay with yourself, but then that drive and energy to actually want to learn how can you be better. And I think one of the things which we have to be better at, and certainly for our younger leaders, is getting them to understand that, which is you're okay. You're secure, you're okay, you're going to be successful, but you're never going to be the finished article. Yeah. And therefore, how do you then pick up the truth about how you really are? And then you can work on that.
Yeah.
And, again, I think it's one of the things which, as you get towards the end of your career, you start to see the people who actually have got the personal curiosity to work out what is it about themselves which is good, and what are the things which they need to be careful about or work on. Yeah. And, that is an odd combination. Not many people are prepared to do that. And of course, the worst thing is if they've had early success in their career, because it's almost impossible to that point to say to them, by the way, I know you've made gazillions, or you're now the top of this organization, but you need to still keep working on yourself. That's sometimes a very hard conversation to have with those individuals.
And it was very nice. On one of the podcast guests, I had Gavin Patterson, who was the CEO, as you remember, of BT.
Yeah, BT, yeah.
And Gavin, at the time when he and I appeared on Radio 4, along with the KPMG chair, which was fascinating, the three of us talking about leadership. I'm just trying to remember who the Radio 4 interviewer was. But anyway, it's gone out of my mind. But Gavin was very confident that time. It was in the midst of when he was having a really good run. But then it didn't work out and he got removed. And the man I met today is much more humble, having learned from that, and much more open that, you never stop learning. I'm always work in progress. And I think I am now a much better coach to the leaders I coach because I've been through a lot of personal development, even in the last 2 years, in my 60s. I'm still prepared to learn so that I can be vulnerable enough that they can be vulnerable with me, because I'm modeling it. And that way, they're not kidding me. They're not making things up, and they can face in. I had a guy the other day who, got some pretty tough feedback from a culture survey, and he actually went out and apologized to them specifically for certain things and said he's gonna work on it. It went down incredibly well, because very rarely do leaders admit that they were wrong. Everybody knows they were wrong, but if they're playing this game where they go, no, it's absolutely fine, it wasn't my fault, the election was stolen from me, I didn't lose, it's unfair, I
agree. And the thing about it is, you do need those. We can talk about when I got fired from Apple. There was a lovely thing which happened there. My best friend from university saw me a couple of months before it all unraveled at Apple, and I was on top of the world. I was living in California, I was in London for some store visits and other stuff, and we had lunch together, and he said it was frightening. It was like having lunch with a god. It was impervious to anything. It was all going to work out perfectly. Of course, then a few months later it went wrong.
What did you learn? What did go wrong, John?
Well, there was lots of things which I got wrong. I went from a very difficult turnaround to the world's most profitable company, and I was still in turnaround mode when I was in Apple. So I just did not fit with the culture in that sense. That was a really big miss. I was going through quite a difficult personal journey at the time, because I'd worked out that I was actually gay. I was still married to my lovely ex-wife. And so I was struggling with all that, and I wasn't attentive enough to the subtlety of the Apple culture. And so therefore I just bounced off them. Anyway, I got back. The story I wanted to tell you, because I think it's really helpful in this regard, was I was driving down to Cupertino in my brand new Mercedes, and I was on the phone to a very good friend of mine in Switzerland, who is not a business person, who doesn't do money, who thinks what you and I do for a living is absolutely mad, because why would you spend your time trying to make money and do all this stuff? It's just not the right stuff to do at all. And I rang him up and I said, I think I'm going to get fired from Apple. And he said to me, good, that will be a great gift for you. And I was like, no, I rang you because I need you to help me keep my job at Apple. I need somebody to talk to. He said, no, you're not going to keep your job at Apple. It's going to be great. You're going to really get the benefit of this. And of course, he was completely correct. I mean, it was a gift because it made me reevaluate what I was really about, what I really wanted out of life, and to also understand in a humble way how I could have got that so wrong. Yeah. And so it was in fact, it was actually almost a rebirth, and I, went on and did a lot of changes as a consequence of that event.
Well, I mean, look, that's just been an incredibly powerful moment on this podcast, where you've talked about the lessons you have, but also that you talked about that you were comfortable enough to realize that you were gay, and living with that situation where, like me, with my masks on of how I felt I had to be as an army officer and that kind of stuff, but who was I really like? You must have felt that you were living behind a mask, but you couldn't be really you. I mean, do you want to just talk about how you managed to come out and what you learned? What would you do different?
It was quite a long and painful process. No, I mean, I think in the end, I mean, again, coming back to my very good friend from university, when I eventually came out to him, he said to me, well, I didn't know you were gay either, John, but how did you not know? And he said, we've already established you have a stunning lack of self-awareness, so you might want to go away and think about that. Because I really had no idea. I was very happily married until this realization late in my marriage, and I think the big part of that was also part of me getting comfortable with myself. It actually turned out again to be a very helpful journey, because when you again, we've talked a little bit about it. When I was growing up in the 80s, being gay was not necessarily an acceptable thing, and be a successful businessman. I remember the guy who was leading Burberry at the time, it was always started off as the gay chief executive XYZ. And I always thought that was a terribly unfair way to label somebody. And I was very frightened that when I came out, that will be a problem. And I was at Dunelm at the time when I did come out. And I think that, but the point about that was that it actually made me very comfortable with myself when I finally admitted to the outside world I was, that, I then had left, at that point, had left my wife, I was sort of, and then moving into gay life. You then are able to actually access vulnerability in a very different way, because you really put yourself out there at that point. And that actually, as it turns out, has probably been the most helpful thing in the last little bit of my career, because it's only 7 or 8 years ago this happened. And so it really got me to understand what vulnerability really meant, both at a professional and a personal level. And then you're able to be much more useful to the people you're working with as a chairman or as a coach or as an advisor.
Yeah. And look, I really respect you and admire you for going through all that journey. I helped 2 of the CEOs that I've coached to come out to their board and to their friends, because we knew that many of us knew that they were gay. One was male, one was female. But once they'd done it, everyone, yeah, it's fine. It's not a problem. I wondered, but I'm really pleased you told us. That's great. And they went on to be better leaders, because they could be genuinely themselves, rather than they, up to that stage, they'd felt they'd had to make up a story again because of thinking that it wasn't acceptable and that kind of stuff. So I'm absolutely delighted about that. And I think that really comes back to...
Andrew, the only thing I would just say, just one little thing, it didn't entirely go comfortably for me, I have to say. So I think most people come out, you're right, 90% of the time, no problem. No problem with my children, no problem with my immediate family, no problems with my immediate friends. But there were a group of people who it was not acceptable for. I mean, I lost a group of friends in America over it. I lost some business relationships over it. So it's not an easy thing to do. But I think in a way, because it was actually slightly painful, it was actually even more useful when you actually were through that, because you were able to reflect on, yeah, it's going to be okay. And sometimes bad things happen, and that is part of the human condition. And you have to be able to deal with that and know that when people are exposing their own vulnerabilities, that it may not actually be an easy journey for them as they go through correcting whatever the issues are in their own life.
Yeah. And I, in my own way, when, for example, I went through divorce before I got remarried, I lost a number of friends who then, when both daughters got married recently, I met those friends again who I'd known very well, but they chose to drop me and stay friends with my ex-wife. And my ex-wife and I now got a good relationship, and we're about to have a grandchild in a week's time. And so I don't mind meeting my ex-wife now, but it was very difficult at the time. And people make a choice and they make a judgment about you, and they perhaps pick up certain stories about you which they believe to be true or whatever, or it doesn't really matter. But there's a huge amount of judgment being thrown around. And sometimes it's more a sad reflection on them than it is on you. But in my particular case, getting divorced, I was always brought up, you don't do that, you stick at it. And so, and I did for 23 years. But I think it's just, it can be quite brutal. And it
can be.
It's never an easy journey, but it takes.
No, I agree with that. But the point which I was trying to make, which is a subtle one, which is really interesting, is that if you believe in the power of vulnerability and you understand where vulnerability comes from, which is shame. Shame is usually because fear of being judged.
Yeah.
And so actually having experienced that in a manifest way, either in your career or in your personal life, makes you much more empathetic to the people who are struggling with something.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what they're struggling with. The point is that you've actually been through the experience before. And again, this I think is the sort of root of all of this stuff. If you are at the most senior positions of leadership in any organization, I don't care what it is, whatever type of organization it is, and you don't have that empathy and you don't understand vulnerability and you don't get to this point in life, then you're actually not very useful for organizations which may be going through major change or transition. It's fine if the sky is blue and everything's sailing along, but as we know, the real test of leadership is when things have gone wrong and actually people have got to come to you and admit there's been some major mistake. And then what are you going to do about it? And that's the time when all of this becomes useful. And that, of course, is where leadership becomes useful. Leadership doesn't become useful on a good day. It's when it's gone wrong.
Yeah. I think that's profound. And I think the thing I'm working on most along the lines of what you're talking about is having good judgment, but being less judgmental about others. Who am I, with all the mistakes that I've made, to judge them? I haven't walked in their shoes. I don't know their life. And be very careful when you look at someone, make a judgment about them, or they say they have an orientation this way, or they're a particular race or a background or whatever it is. And people go, oh, I'm not that, like, I'm really good this way. I've got a, had someone who sort of said, I'm not racist. I've got a friend who's Jamaican. Yeah, well, how are you treating everybody you meet? Not just because you have a token friend who's Jamaican doesn't make you necessarily not a racist. So I think it's a fascinating area. Hey, John, there's so much that we can talk about. We almost need to do another podcast in a few months' time. But let's, as we come to the last 5 minutes, let's just think about a couple of a tip about toxic teams, a favorite book, and then we'll do the 2-minute top tip. You've been a turnaround specialist. When you've inherited a toxic team or a culture, what would be the top tip you'd give listeners around the world about turning around a toxic team or culture? What have you done?
Well, I mean, it's tricky because often the way that you have to deal with toxic teams is you have to start firing people. And that's the fact of the matter is, because there will be, within any group of people, there will be people who you're able to change and rehabilitate. But there will also be people who are just going to slow you down and are just not up for it. So, for example, I had, because of the nature of the turnaround we had to do at Dixon's, I had 12 direct reports, 10 left quite quickly. And that gives you a terrible reputation in the market. but it was absolutely necessary to make that happen. In fact, it got deeper than that, because we had 125 people with the title director. When I started, when I left, there were 32 people with the title of director, of which 20 were new. So wow. You only had a 1 in 10 chance. So if you have to move fast, quite often you actually have to make that fundamental change. Now, I'm not a great proponent of this, because I often see people go in and take that kind of example as sort of carte blanche reason for going in, firing the team and starting with a new team. I don't think that's a good idea either, because you often then throw, metaphorically, the baby out with the bathwater. There are some really good things within any organisation, and the 2 people I retained turned out to be absolutely fantastic and a critical part of the turnaround. So there is often a lot of change you have to make to the individuals. But the biggest thing you have to do in leadership is you have to demonstrate what you want, and then you have to live it. You have to absolutely find the examples to say, look, you know, we're here, but we need to be here, and here are the examples which I'm going to use to pull the organisation. And that is the tricky thing, because you've got to pick the right things which are achievable in a reasonable time frame, so that the organisation gets it. Not easy.
Not easy. No. Well, look, there's a lot in that, and thank you for that. You talked about in favorite books some of the work by Brené Brown, which you and I both enjoyed, Power of Vulnerability and Shame. But also, I think you thought Good to Great was a helpful one, albeit yes, time has shown that not all those companies are still going well. But at the time, I think there were some good lessons from that. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a very important book for me. I mean, I think for lots of different reasons, but a few things which stood out. The first one was that what Jim Collins showed with the data was that that often leaders are actually reflective introverts who actually are very humble and careful about the way in which they lead. They aren't what Hollywood tell you is the archetypal chief executive. In fact, he would argue in the book that those type of people are actually less successful leaders over long periods of business success. So that was really good, because I think that opens up leadership to many more people, which is a good thing. And people will be surprised to say, but I'm actually an introvert. I've learned how to communicate and how to broadcast and how to be more engaging. But my private time is very much in my garden doing my reading on my own. Perfect. That's the perfect weekend for me. And then I think the other bit which was great was that the whole thing about clockmaking a business. So he has this wonderful chapter in the book where he talks about how a good chief executive thinks about making the business like a clock, all the bits and pieces which you have to have in place in order to make a successful organization for customers and for the people who work in it, and deliver a reasonable result from a profit perspective. And I think that perspective was really helpful to me, because that's actually how I think about business too. But it's having that validated in that way, etc. And there are lots of other great things about the book. I'm a little bit less worried about the track record of companies, because everything is only a moment in time anyway. I always thought that was a bit of an unfair critique. But I think that some of the patterns which he's recognises in that book are true. They clearly are true. And certainly after my experience of working in retrospect, and I read that book 30 years ago, I would say that the patterns which he points out were absolutely right. They were very helpful and very useful.
Brilliant. No, I would agree with you. So we're at the final stage. John, would you be kind enough, just for this bit, it stands in its own right as well as being part of this, just to introduce yourself, just give a little nutshell of some of the jobs that you've worked in and what you're doing now in the role as chairman and NED, and share with us a practical top leadership tip that would be useful to people listening. So over to you, John.
Yeah, so I'm John Browett. I'm a non-executive chairman of various organisations, including the Octopus Group and the IOD. Before that, I worked as a retail chief executive for many years, first at Tesco, starting Tesco.com, then doing the turnaround of Dixon's Retail, which is now called Currys. And I worked at Apple for a brief time, famously. hired and fired in 6 months. And then I worked and did a couple of smaller turnarounds of businesses in retail, Monsoon Accessorize, and then the digital transformation of Dunelm. My top tip, oh gosh, I don't think it's one thing. There are so many things you've got to get right to be a good leader in any business. I think the big thing which most leaders need to spend time on is knowing themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a simple thing to say, and it's so easy to get wrong because you're so easily, the ego is so wants to fool yourself, but really getting to know yourself, good and bad, is a critical part of being able to actually lead a big group of people.
I think that's a great tip, John, and a lovely way to end what has been a fascinating conversation. And you've role modeled authenticity, vulnerability, talked a lot about your life. This has been very powerful. I just want to say a big thank you from everybody who's listening for that, and wish you continued success in all the different stages of your career that you're helping people with. All this experience that you've got, I know it would be incredibly useful. So thank you for being on the Inspiring Leadership Podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me, Andrew. It's a real pleasure.
Okay, my pleasure. Bye.